Thank you for coming along. This is January's session. It's our second session. We had Damien Peach for Winter Warmer a couple of weeks ago. So that's who you're following, Nick.
No problem. I like Damo. Known Damo years. We did the Lunar World Record together. So.
We've got, as you've heard already, Nick Howes is come to speak to us. That's great. A little chat on, oh my God, we're all going to die. So if you're feeling a little bit down or you've taken some special pills or whatever, then perhaps switch off now, because it's going to be a realization that if it's not COVID that gets you, there's something else out there that perhaps might. Okay.
Indeed, possibly. Right, I shall.
So here we go. The usual, which is if you want to find out more information about what we're up to, we post it all on our website. It also goes on our Facebook page, and occasionally we've been known to tweet. For those that are new, we try to do this the last Wednesday of every month. And when COVID eventually goes, then our regular haunt is actually the Herschel Museum of Astronomy. But until then, we'll be based on Zoom for pretty much all of our activities until we can work out a nice, safe way of observing and actually helping people out. Current membership isn't doing too badly. We're at 40, and we have a new member on our organising team. So Mike Hasborn has joined as an ordinary officer, which means that he picks up actions here and there. But we've got Abby, Chris, Jonathan, Mike, and myself. So if you do see someone and you put a little mask on, I've helped with Mike there. If you see that face with that mask on, stay 2 meters away, but feel free to ask him any questions you like. Really, we're here to help you as an organising team. So if there's anything you want, anything you think we should be doing a bit more of, then please just raise your voice, send us your feedback, your ideas. You can do that direct to us. Each of us has got an email address. So say Simon Holbeach at bathaastronomers.org.uk will get to me. Or if you just use hello at, so everyone in the organising team has a sort of a forwarding. So that's an easy way of getting hold of us. But we really want your ideas on things that we could do better, things that you really wish we could do, what would you perhaps seen elsewhere and you think we'd be good to do it as well. So one of the things we're going to do is for those that can't attend, we've got a few of our members here, but not all. We'll send out a bit of a brief email questionnaire just to ask for some help in sort of ideas to move things forward, because I'm sure you want more than just monthly talks, and perhaps you've got some ideas about who would be a great person to come and speak to us. Perhaps you've seen them before, you've heard them, you've seen them online, and don't feel constrained to the UK now. Zoom allows us to do it internationally as well. Feel free, fire the ideas in, and then you can leave us with the problems of how to get hold of these people. As I've recently found, sometimes you have to deal with agents. You can't actually talk to the person direct, which is a bit strange, but I'm getting used to that. Other things, and we have been running previously sessions on how to do stuff. So we'd organize a hall, get some telescopes in there, you bring your own, and we'd sort of have a look at them. We can't do that now. So one of the suggestions would be, would you like us to sort of run some either live sessions or record some videos of how to do certain things? So if there's something you haven't worked out how to do on your telescope, or with your binoculars, or something in the night sky that you'd like an explanation, we can organize just making a little video podcast for you, and make those available on our YouTube channel as well, but send you a link. And so anything, it's sort of like, how do I set my tripod up? How do I collimate my reflector? There's lots of videos out there, but perhaps you want one of us, one of the people within our society, to actually give you a bit of a hand. And you can ask specifically about a bit of kit, and perhaps we can give you a bit more of the tailored advice on it. So any ideas, again, just fire them in, and you can use the hello at Bath if you want to, use Messenger on Facebook, whatever way to get hold of us, whatever is effective. And we did have a social just before Christmas. If you think that actually that would be fun to do something similar, or something maybe social but on slightly different lines, then again, we'd love to see what we can organise to keep the dark winter nights as enjoyable as possible. Okay. So what I wanted to do reasonably swiftly is I get lots of questions about the community observatory that we've been working on here and there, and not much over the last year or so. But I wanted to give you a quick reflection of where we've got to with it, just so you know. And so if you feel that you want to get involved and you feel you can help us out, then please fire your ideas through. And once we're out of lockdown, then there's potential for individual visits to actually see, so we can organize that as well. So this is back in a photo from July 2019, and this is the first side of the telescope. I knew there was an observatory down in Monkton Combe. I'd walked past it, and this is the site I'd seen many a time walking past. But in July 2019, I noticed this. This is the other side of it. The roof had collapsed in on itself, and it gave an opportunity for someone very nosy like me to jump up on a rock and have a look to see what was inside. And this is what we saw about a year and a half ago. An old looking telescope and lots of muck around. And then I managed to get hold of the deputy head of Monkton Combe and have a chat and said, can we help you out? And he let us in. And so we got to see up close the Monkton Combe telescope. It's a 7-inch refractor, which dates from anywhere between 1850 and 1870. And it's been in a bit of a poor state of repair for quite a while now. So we agreed with the school that if we can help then restore it, we'd make it a community observatory, so we could operate it as well as the school using it as well. So a shared facility. They'd pick up the bills for the major works, but for all our help, we'd get to have access to it, use it, and effectively share it. And with them paying the bills, I quite like that arrangement. So we got in touch with the Society for the History of Astronomy, and this is Chris Taylor. And in September, he came along, September 2019, to rescue the objective, because we knew that the objective needed a proper looking at, because if the rest of the telescope was anything to go by, someone had probably been playing around, messing around with the main lens. So he offered to take that back to Hamwell Community Observatory, which he helps run, and dismantle it and actually see whether it was back to front or it had any problems with it. So that was very good of him. And you noticed the roof. So the school were good enough to start in November, just a couple of months after we had our first meeting. They came in and they had the roof repaired on the observatory. So it became watertight, and they actually gave me a set of the keys for the lock and the padlock on the front. So that's when we gained general access day to day in there. And this was one of our first trips in. You can see the paint's all falling off. There's water was dripping down, which is why the telescope's covered by a tarpaulin. A lot of the wood was damp. There's lots of muck all over the place. And note, there were, from the early 1980s, there were articles pinned to the wall, first light on La Palma. So it was a bit of a time capsule. So the last time it was actually actively used was about 35 years ago. So it hadn't been in major proper use for that period of time. So kind of exciting to what we're going to find when we start taking these apart and see how they're going. But it had a reasonably traditional Victorian style Romsey observatory, which didn't seem to be of the same age of the telescope. So we started doing some investigations, and there were bits missing from the telescope. So this is the first time we actually had to make up some of the focus mechanism. And so we 3D printed the rack here before we actually had that made up by Mike in brass. So we started little repairs all the way back in 2019. It did work. So when the sun came out, we could open up the shutters with a bit of heft and making sure you didn't bash your head too much. And it actually does rotate. There's 2 ropes, one on either side. So if you go and pick up one of those ropes and haul it over your shoulder and make sure you don't pull your back, if you look very carefully, it is actually rotating, but that's quite a lot of heft to move it. So there's still a few bits and pieces to do, but it's had a bit of oil since we tried to move it around here. Actually, when we, in the last year, in 2020, in the summer, we came up with a set of safe working practices. And so we actually got in to start doing some real work on here. And we got the 7-inch objective back. The housing had been machined out because it was too tight. We found out that the flint was warped because of the way that, so a lens is made up of 2 lenses. One's the crown, typically in the front, and the flint is behind. Because of the way it being put together and compressed, then the flint at the back had been distorted, and that distortion still in the lens today. So someone had a bit of a DIY go at it a long time ago, and they have damaged the front. Hard to think you can damage lenses through actually compression, but that's what's actually happened. We cleaned up a lot of the sides, we cleaned up the brass work, and we repaired the sight scope on it. So it had a smashed objective on there. So we repaired that, and you can see there's lots of black on the end of the telescope. Those are adapters that we 3D printed to fit in modern eyepieces to make it work. And actually using the finder that existed on the telescope was a bit of a pain. So we've actually put a modern finder on there as well, because it's easier to align. There isn't much of adjustment on the finder on the main telescope. So the work team, happy little bunch there. So thanks Chris, Mike, for helping out in the summer. We had a number of jobs to do. I think Mike always got the fun one. And then we found out that there was lead-based paint. So that wasn't so good. We took some original sort of images of trying to work out how bad that warping was on the lens. It was a terrible night to do this, so you don't really get much of it, but we can see from the shapes of the moving, there's a bit of coma that's coming out, which is a distortion in the lens. And then on a better night, actually this was using an artificial star posted several hundred meters away. We managed to start getting some diffraction going. So we still have a problem with the lens, but it is a functional telescope in terms of the optics. It's just we could do a bit more, it needs a bit more work. So the other things that we got to do with the telescope is we put a base around it, a seat, and we started addressing sort of the health and safety issues, as well as taking all that lead-based paint off and repainting the telescope. We kept the blue color because that's the school colors, but cleaned up the brass work where the levers had been overpainted. We removed that paint and returned them to brass and put lacquer on them. So it's a lot prettier than it was before. And with the hard work of Chris, we've got some electrics in there. So we've got a 12-volt circuit in there to do the lighting and other gadgets and gizmos that we'll be looking forward to put on there, because we'll have other telescopes in here as well to store and then use those outside. And so this 12-volt gives a supply to the outside as well. So your MEAs, your Celestrons that need 12 volts, you don't need to carry a battery. You'll get the source feed from here. So it starts looking a bit pretty at night. And this is the kind of image that we've now got, which is a little bit better. Everything's been painted. We've got a good coat on everything. So it should, at least on the inside, be a lot better. And we'll talk to the school about doing some work on the outside in the near future. It does have a clock, which helps drive the RA. And Mike cleaned that up. and that's running. We've got to do some tweaking to make it run a bit more with the Earth's rotation, but it looks very pretty and it sounds great. And also on the inside, what we did, we put up notice boards so that kids and ourselves can put up information about what's going on in the night sky, but they can also have their projects. And we didn't want to lose those wonderful things that were posted from the 1980s. So all those things that were on the walls from the original observatory have been taken off and laminated. And so they're now stored and on display within there. There's a bit of a reminiscence of those kids. I think I can read on the top of one of those, 1984 is an article, February 1984. Still work to do. We're going to put some solar panels on the back to keep those 12-volt system nicely charged up. And we've got a whole water is coming in. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but water's coming in at the top just here. So I had a very remote meeting. I walked out doing my daily exercise to Monkton Combe, met up with these 2 employees of Monkton Combe School, kept social distancing, had a meeting, and then I walked my daily allowance of walking back home. So things are still moving forward. And they're looking to do some work to make it watertight at the top. So I mentioned the Society for the History of Astronomy. They're actually publicising what we're up to. And so we're in their next e-news for February. So that's kind of exciting. So that's the kind of where we've got to on the community observatory at Monkton Combe. So no doubt there'll be more involvement, and once we get out of lockdown and we can come up with a safe way of using it, then it'll be become part of our normal observing regime, to have somewhere nice out of the wind where we can observe, reasonable parking, reasonably dark, and a good centre for storing bits and pieces. What else is going on in the coming month? We've got the star count, which starts on the 6th of February, so only just over a week away, where you can count the stars within Orion and register those back with the CPRE, the Countryside Charity. So we can get a take on how light pollution is going. They've been doing it, so they were doing it every 5 or so years. They've now turned it to annual because the change is quite radical, and they want to get a better handle on it. So if we looked at last year's results, these are the counts from the Bath area, and we can see there's a few yellow splodges, which is light pollution, but a lot of it is red around Bath, and we don't get anything near green, and I think you might have had to have a few whiskies before you see the light yellow. So we do have a problem, and it would be great if you can take part from your gardens, or if you do your nighttime exercise, if you can get to somewhere, then please get your counts in and register in. I think I kind of counted at least 20 odd counts that we got in from Bath Astronomers. So it would be good to have counts coming in again this year. We do produce, and then on the website, some aids to doing the count. So sort of little charts you can fill in and draw in where you think. And so one of them is a straight, the one on the left is a straight sort of draw what you see, and then on the right actually there's the visual magnitude listed in order. So if you can see a particular star, you know you're seeing the 15th brightest star within the group. So it's great. If you want to register, then I think I did put if you want to register, just go to our website and Star Count 2021, and that will actually take you to the CPRE site to register, and they can send you all the details on how you can actually submit your count. So if you go there, Star Count 2021, that's there. If you wanted this additional material, if you want to see the results, go to Star Count 2020 results, and here, this is just straight on the website, so I think you actually that links off the front page. I should wrap up because I'm always talking too long. Just to say that our next speaker is going to be Nora Eisner from University of Oxford, and she's going to be talking to us about TESS, which is the Transiting Exoplanet Survey Satellite, and all the work she does in terms of citizen science and things like is it Zooniverse? To allow you to make observations and see the cyclic period of exoplanets and pick it out, because our eyes, our brains are slightly better than algorithms on some of the tougher spots. So that's a great one to come along to. So that's the 24th of February, 7:30. So normal place, normal Zoom. Right, I've talked way too long. It's certainly time to hand over to Nick Howes. He sent me a lovely bio about his 16 years experience, cutting edge research and development. He's had lots of jobs, and he's hinted us of a few of them whilst we were opening up. Former Deputy Director of the Kielder Observatory, Sci-Comms for ESA, software development for the SKA Telescope, Program Manager for the Faulkes Telescope. And because of that Faulkes involvement, helping to discover dozens of new asteroids. I also think, Nick, you came up with the idea of the median probe to send to Mars.
Yeah, which is undergoing testing in the Mojave. Well, it was a pre-lockdown in Mojave. So.
Yeah, so Nick could well have his idea and all his support that he's lent to this for spotting methane and sending multiple probes reasonably cheaply to Mars on board an existing mission. But by having multiple probes, you can work out where the methane's coming from. And that's a lot better. At the moment we sniff and we know there's methane, but we haven't really got any idea where it might be coming from. With Nick's idea, if that comes, well, when I say if it comes to fruition, it's got through every barrier, so every gateway so far. So it's got a good chance, I think, Nick.
Yeah. NASA Glenn did a peer review, and they really liked it. And there's a lot of spin-offs that we're looking at in the defence sector as well, in terms of what we can do for Earth observation in dangerous areas, so like volcanoes.
So if you have a crazy idea,
don't give up.
Take a leaf out of Nick's book and don't give up. It's taken a while, because I think that was 2012 you had that idea. But hey, it's come a huge way, and space missions always take a lot of time. So well done with that. Nick's also mentioned his regular spot on Space Store with Terry Mosley. It's a YouTube channel. It's run by the Space Store based at Didcot. And every fortnight they have a roundup, Terry and Nick, of what's going on in space. They pick some subjects and they just yak about it. And it's great. It's an absolute, so if they're all stored on YouTube, but you can also watch it live. Then it's well worth to hear the experience of the old guard and the new guard having a good banter. And there's definite friendship, strong friendship between Terry and you, Nick. So you get that feeling that you're just in a corner of a pub and you're listening to two blokes chatting. It's absolutely great.
It's kind of like the two Ronnies of space, as we like to think of ourselves.
So it's not there's some academic credibility, and Nick's he's a fellow of the BIS, of the Royal Astronomical Society. He works at a company called BMT Space R&D, which is part of the BMT Defence and Security group, or it's associated with, part of the same group.
No, we're part of the Defence and Security.
Oh, you are part of the group. Yep. Okay. And it must be a good company, because I applied for a job there and they said no. So that's a really good sign of a company. So he knows what he's talking about, and he's actively involved in a day-to-day basis on actually putting satellites up there. From the UK space sector, and we all know how that's growing, and the launch capabilities that have been developed in for the UK. It'll be the kind of work that Nick's doing that will actually be utilising a lot of that. So that'd be great. So I've talked so much, so I'm going to hand over to Nick now to give us his talk on, oh my God, we're all going to die, and enjoy.
Fabulous, thank you so much. Just to say as well, the BMT offices up until quite recently, until lockdown, we were about a stone's throw from the Herschel Museum. So right literally opposite the end of King William Street. So we're next to the BT building there, so on Plymouth House. We've 3 offices in Bath, and we are still hiring now, Simon. So again, don't give up. We've got about 6 pages of jobs because we're desperately trying to get more people. It's been a busy year, putting it nicely. Anyway, lovely introduction. Got some interesting side points I'll touch on during the course of this that link into some of the things you've been saying. But this is I've been giving this talk for a few years now, and to a range of different people, age from like 8 to 80. First time I gave this was at Kielder to a Cubs group and had some of them in tears. So be warned. It's challenging and interesting and hopefully thought-provoking. That's the key thing. So life and death in space, aka oh my god, we're all going to die. Tinfoil hats at the ready. So when I give this talk, I normally talk about the most threatening objects in space as we know it. So if we look up at the sky and we're into astronomy, we can probably say, you go into an outreach thing with kids and you say, right, what's the most terrifying thing in space? And a lot of kids will put their hands up and they'll say, oh, it's a black hole. And you think, yep, black holes are truly terrifying. It's the strongest gravitational force in the universe. It's no longer theoretical. We've obviously imaged them now directly with a whole range of telescopes. There's a wonderful story about the movie Interstellar, and when the science the science team who were advising on it were giving the CG team, the graphics team, some of the data that they had, and the computer models that were coming back and the visualizations that were coming back. The scientific advisors were saying, well, that's not what a black hole looks like. But then they said, well, that's based upon what data you've given us. And then a few years later, they imaged the black hole directly, and it looked exactly like what they were seeing in Interstellar, which I thought was quite amazing. Black holes, I mean, the nearest one to us is HR 6819. Which is about 3,000 light years away. We don't really have to worry ourselves too much about that. They are really nasty. We don't want to be anywhere near one. We've got a massive one, obviously, in the center of our galaxy, and in the center of most galaxies are supermassive black holes. There was a recent observation detailed on GNZ11, which is now the farthest object ever observed. Using some of the Hubble observation data. And again, you've got to wonder, only 400 million years after the Big Bang, how the heck there's a supermassive black hole there and how stellar formation is happening. So there's all sorts of stuff. But black holes, yes, they're scary, but we can kind of not worry about them too much. Then you say to kids, okay, well, it's not a black hole. What's the scariest thing in space? And they'll say, oh, supernova. And you say, yep, supernovas are really bad. And we all had the excitement last year of Betelgeuse and everybody thinking, because that dust kind of obscuration that we saw, that it was dimming down and it was getting ready to go pop. And it could go pop. It could have gone pop already. We don't know. It could go pop tonight. We're not going to see it for 430 years because it's 430 light years away approximately. Nearest star to us that potentially is a progenitor for supernova is Pegasi B, UK Pegasi B at 150 light years. Again, it's too far to give us any real grief. Anything under about 40 to 50 light years, then there could be some potential knock-on effects, huge amounts of gamma radiation, etc., being emitted. But it's one of those things that when Betelgeuse eventually does go pop, it's going to look beautiful. The constellation of Orion will never look the same again. It's going to be as bright as a full moon. We've not had anything anywhere remotely near us since 1987 with SN97A, which was Southern Hemisphere, so we really didn't see it here. But if you go back to 1054 with the formation of the Crab Nebula in Taurus, we probably had the last great big explosive event that we were really fortunate to see, or humanity was fortunate to see. So yes, supernovas are scary, but we don't really have to worry too much about those. Then we come on to gamma ray bursts. A great pub quiz question, this one. What's the furthest object anyone's ever seen with the naked eye? And people say, oh, it's M31. And you say, no, it's not. It's M33 anyway. But we won't go into that. Or, there's various other ones. If you're Stephen O'Meara and you've been hyperventilating on oxygen on the top of a mountain, you've probably seen way further than that even. But there was an incident a few years ago in South Africa where a amateur astronomer witnessed the light glow, the afterglow of a gamma ray burst. Now, this thing was in the millions of light years away. So GRBs, they literally, thankfully, do occur millions of light years away from the Earth. The explosions they generate enough energy to outshine the entire galaxy and will generate more energy during the course of their bursts than the sun will generate over its entire 10 billion year lifetime. So you don't want to be in the beam direction of one of these. It's not fun, kind of like a big lighthouse. But again, thankfully, as far as we know, there's nothing relatively close to us that's going to go GRB and pop, so reasonably okay. Then we move on to my favorite topic with anyone I talk to in North America, which is aliens. And what is the scariest thing from space? Yes, aliens potentially could be the scariest thing from space. If you go back to, the heady days of Roswell in 1947 and all of the conspiracy theories that have been tagged on since that, and fantastic movies like Mars Attacks, which you can probably see now. A great little spoof take on the whole thing. Interestingly, that guy looks so much like Dick Cheney, it's not funny. Just let this one run. But essentially, the little green men from Mars, speculation from the likes of H.G. Wells, etc., of War of the Worlds. Are we going to see anything like this in our lifetimes? Probably not. Probably not. Especially not something like that, we hope. The reality is more like this. The potential for life, it would be ridiculous to say that we are the only life in the universe. There are 250 billion stars in our galaxy. There are 250 billion to 400 billion galaxies that we know of. Each one of those stars could potentially host a number of planets, and exoplanet detections from the likes of TESS, SuperWASP, and various other surveys are increasing at a pace. Even within our own solar system, we've got Enceladus, which we know is producing vast amounts of water. We've got Europa, and you can ignore Arthur C. Clarke because there are landings going to be happening on Europa at some point. We've obviously got Mars. We still don't know if there's potentially life on Mars. That's one of the key studies that Simon was talking about with respect to the methane. Something's producing methane, either biological or non-biological. We still don't know yet. So we've got the Trace Gas Orbiter orbiting Mars at the moment. We've got various probes on the way to Mars now to try and help us understand this more. Hopefully within the next 15 to 20 years, we'll have boots on the ground on Mars. If Elon Musk gets his way, maybe even sooner. Essentially, we still don't know. There could be life on Mars. There could be even life on Titan. We don't know in our own solar system. What we do know is that life on this Earth is the only thing we know about at this time. We had the recent exciting signal from Proxima Centauri, which turned out to be interference and noise, and but it's given us more and more data that we can use to calibrate and hopefully improve over the coming years, decades, with things like the SKA Telescope. If you don't know about the SKA Telescope, massive, huge telescope project, which is capable of detecting a mobile phone at 10 light years and an airport radar at 30 light years. It's astonishingly sensitive. That's part of its problem, in that the sensitivity is going to be wrecked by various things I'll talk about in a little while as well. And it can pick up, anything, your washing machine being turned on in Perth, it can pick up from Murchison in Australia. It's ludicrously sensitive. Huge array of telescopes in South Africa and Australia, which is slowly coming online. It's been talked about now for 20 years, and they've had a base up at Jodrell Bank now for the best part of 10 years, and it's still just coming online. So absolutely enormous infrastructure project. But aliens is not the biggest threat. I'll show you what the biggest threat is. That's the biggest threat. So we all love a good comet. We had, thankfully, at the beginning of lockdown, we had a really nice comet. Hopefully everyone got to see that. We don't get many in the Northern Hemisphere of late. Obviously, 1997, we had Hale-Bopp. We've had Comet McNaught, which you can see there. We've had some of Lovejoy, Terry Lovejoy's fantastic comets as well. Unless you've got really good instrumentation, good telescopes, good CCDs, most of the comets that we look at in the sky are just kind of tiny little fuzzballs. Occasionally, rarely, we'll get a really spectacular one, and McNaught was one of those spectacular ones. The C2006 P1, the tail that you're looking at there was 150 million miles in length. So it was basically twice the distance, or 1.5 times the distance from the Earth to the Sun. It was spectacularly long. But if you were to take all of the dust and water and ice that's in that tail, now obviously comets generate multiple tails. There's the ion tail, there's a dust tail, plasma tails, etc. But what we're looking at there is a dust tail. So the dust tail and those synodic stripes caused by interactions with the solar wind, essentially about 150 million miles in length. If you were to take every single particle in that and condense it down, you'd have about the equivalent of an Olympic-sized swimming pool's worth of water. So it's very, very tenuous. And every year we pass through comet tails all the time. This is why we get things like the Perseids, etc. We all know that. It's why we get meteor showers. We pass through the kind of remnant dust tails of comets that are orbiting all through our solar system. So you think, well, what's the threat of that? I mean, it's not a big one. You go back to the early 1900s, there was a whole story of Comet Halley and people selling anti-comet pills and gas masks to the unsuspecting and dubious public who thought they were all going to die because of cyanide poisoning and various other things that were being discovered using, you know, early days spectroscopy, as it were, from comets. But you think, well, is that really a threat? Well, let's look at the comet in a bit more detail. The comet that you typically see with the naked eye with a telescope, you're looking at the coma and the tail. You're not looking at the actual heart of the comet, the nucleus of the comet. And the first time we really got a good view of that was in the mid-1980s with Comet Halley. With the Japanese probes, the European Giotto probe, and anyone who remembers that will remember that as it approached Halley, it literally got shot blasted to hell. The front-facing plate on it, it was almost like a shotgun was going off every second. Tiny particles, but striking at incredible velocities. You go back to your physics, K equals half mv squared. The kinetic energy of even a very small object at those kind of velocities is extreme, and this is another part of the problem that I'll talk about in a minute. Now, comets come in all ranges, shapes and sizes. Halley was the largest one that we've imaged up close. Some of them don't even look like comets. You look at the image of 9P Temple 1 there, it could be an asteroid. Until it becomes active, you don't really know. Borreley, another one, this kind of peanut shape or this jewel shape is becoming more and more commonly seen in some of the comets we've observed since then. 103P Hartley 2, it's a comet very close to my heart. I did a lot of work observing that as part of the follow-on from the Deep Impact mission. 103P Hartley 2 was hyperactive. It was a really, really active comet for its size. Tiny little comet, but you know, huge amounts of emission from it. 81P Vil 2 is another one. Again, looks a little bit like an asteroid, and you think, well, okay, well, what's the threat here? What's the issue? Well, we'll zoom in on 103P Hartley 2. Now, here we have a comet that had a really interesting structure. So what you can see there is this kind of Kentucky Fried Chicken drumstick shape, where you've got the rotation of the comet, which is only a matter of hours, basically dragging the material to the two lobes. And you have this very smooth intersection in the middle. Some of the calculations that we did after the close approach proved that if this comet was spinning much faster, it would literally rip itself apart. So these kind of conjoined lobes, as it were, would tear themselves apart. And this is one of the key problems with comets. And we've imaged loads of those with the Faulkes Telescope, where they begin to fragment. Now, comets can be disrupted and fragment for a whole number of reasons, and we still don't understand all of them. We know that if a comet comes in close to the sun, then obviously the sun's gravitational field and the interaction with the solar wind and solar radiation and all the other things as it's approaching the sun are going to wreak havoc. And a lot of comets will, ISON being a classic example, get literally torn apart and destroyed by the sun if they approach too closely. The thing with 103P, I'll just go through some of the other images. I mean, these images are typically what the average person in the street will see, or the average astronomer will see of a comet. I mean, they don't look like a major issue. You get up close. This is an image I took of 2014 Q2 Lovejoy, one of the better comets. Again, you can see the dust tail there and the striations and the way that obviously it's flowing away from the sun. We all know that the comet's tails, as it's approaching the sun, will face away from the sun, but even as it's going out, it'll also face away from the sun because it's a solar wind that's kind of driving this away. Now, in the last few years, we had the Rosetta mission. So European Space Agency, and I was working on the ground support side of this with Faulkes. Again, it was one of those things that initially the comet that was being targeted, they couldn't launch in time. They had all sorts of issues, so they redirected to 67P Cheremenov-Gerasimenko, or Cherry Jerry as we affectionately called it, because it was nice and easy to say. And when we got up close, when the Rosetta spacecraft and Philae eventually landed and bounced all over it, got up close, this kind of weird shape appeared. Initially, it was likened to a duck. I rather liken it to Crush from the movie Finding Nemo. It looks a little bit more like that. But the comet, when we got up close, again, we could see fracture lines in the comet structure, and again, indications on the rotation rate that this was in effect two objects that were almost conjoined at the hip, as it were, and potentially could rip themselves apart. Now, where's the issue with that? I'll go on to that in a minute. So going back to 67p, that image on the left is the deepest image that has or will ever be taken of that comet, and that was taken by my team with the Faulkes Telescope when it was out round about the orbit of Neptune. The reason I say it is the deepest image because the orbit changed at its last pass, and it will never go out that far again. So that was quite an interesting one. And Richard Miles, I know from the BA, did a lot of work on this as well. And there's a whole active comet observing group. Nick and the various people at the BA coordinate this. Really, really good group to get involved with. What we called this image was the Hunter and the Hunted, because that was 67p and that was a Rosetta spacecraft as it flew by the Earth. So it was one of those kind of just fun things to do. Anyway, going back to our problem, back to the scary stuff. So why are comets scary? This is the Oort cloud. So Jan Oort, Ernst Opik, quite a few decades ago now, basically theorized, and it's still a theory because we haven't imaged anything there directly, that at approximately 1-ish light years away from our sun, there is a swarm of comets. Now, there have been various observations with the Herschel Space Telescope in the infrared around other star systems that have indicated that they have very similar clouds surrounding them. The amount of water vapor surrounding some of the star systems that have been observed indicates that there are masses of comets. Now, when I say masses of comets, the theoretical number that's being postulated at the moment is anywhere between 800 billion and 1 trillion comets out at 1 light year from the Earth. Now, our Earth orbits our sun, and our sun and our solar system orbit the center of our galaxy approximately every 250 million years. And during that time, the solar system dips up and down through the galactic plane and encounters other rogue stars and other things. We encounter, other objects in space. And the comets themselves will, go to kind of strange orbits. So they'll be held in typically pretty good elliptical orbits, but you will get interactions, you will get collisions. And when these happen, objects then come in to the inner solar system. The strongest gravitational field anywhere nearby is the sun, still even at 1 light year out. So they'll begin this very long, slow march. And this is where the long period comets tend to come from, the comets with, greater than, I think it's 100-year periods. I don't know, I've forgotten the exact number now, but essentially the C class of comets. So when they're out at this distance, they're typically moving at around about the velocity of a 747, so not going particularly quickly. By the time they start coming into the solar system and reach their aphelion, perihelion point, so when they get closest to the sun, they can be moving at anywhere up to 186 to 300,000 miles an hour. Now, if you've got an object, for example, the size of Hale-Bopp, and Hale-Bopp's nucleus was calculated at 35 kilometers in diameter, traveling at those kind of velocities, you're looking at something quite significant and quite problematic. And that's out of the Oort cloud. Now, if we move in a bit closer, we come to the Edgeworth-Kuiper belt, or the Kuiper belt as it's more commonly known. So Edgeworth and Kuiper, again, initially theoretical, but now observed and imaged quite extensively. Lots and lots of the large sky survey telescopes, things like the Keck telescopes, for example. Obviously, we've had the Hubble up in orbit now for over 20 years, imaging objects out in the Kuiper belt, assisting projects like the New Horizons spacecraft, which flew by Pluto and is now observing more and more Kuiper belt objects. This again is a major problem for us. So typically some of the shorter period comets, the P-class comets, will come from the Kuiper belt region. This is an area, as you can see, between typically the orbits of Neptune and Pluto. So not particularly far away, far enough away that it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, as it were. But again, theoretically, there are anywhere between 800 million and 1 billion comets in the Kuiper belt. Now, again, these can interact with each other. The orbits can be disrupted. They can be disrupted even by planetary motions, etc. And then they start to drift in again to the inner solar system. Now, again, the problem with this is that we don't see them. Comets, the albedo of a comet is typically that about 25% that of a lump of coal. So if you switch the lights off in a room and held up a lump of coal at the back of the room, you wouldn't be able to see it. So imaging these things before they light up is extremely difficult. Very, very low albedo. They are being imaged, but we haven't catalogued anywhere near all of them yet. So these objects are a potential threat, because once they get perturbed and they drift in, it's not until they cross typically the orbit of Saturn or Jupiter, when they start to get warmed up by the solar radiation pressure and across what's called the ice line, that we begin to see them. At that point, they're typically around about 9 months to a year from their closest approach either to the Earth or the Sun. So you can see where I'm going with this problem. Moving in even closer, we've got the asteroid belt. So we've got 700,000 to 800,000 known and catalogued asteroids in the asteroid belt. And you think, well, that's okay. They're asteroids. They're in locked orbits, or typically reasonably stable orbits. That's fine until we started discovering active asteroids, or basically comets. So some of these objects are lighting up, and you only have to take the analogy of a hairdryer. You hold a hairdryer in your hand, you haven't got it switched on, it's not doing anything. As soon as you switch it on, you're feeling the force of that hairdryer trying to push against you. And if you light up a comet, essentially what's going to happen is there's going to be some disruption in its orbit, and potentially it could collide. And then at that point, from the asteroid belt, which is between the orbits obviously of Mars and Jupiter, you're looking at a time to reach the Earth of anywhere between 6 and 9 months. And again, some of these objects are quite significant in size. So let's move on to my next slide. To give you an idea of the scale of the problem, if you can see that animation there, that's the scale of the problem in terms of near-Earth objects and objects that cross, both the Earth's plane, Mars's plane, and in the asteroid belt. And that's quite a nice graphical representation of what approximately 700,000 asteroids and/or comets looks like. So we've got a good handle on about 95% of these from various sky surveys, but we still get thrown a curveball. We still get thrown, objects come in that we don't know and we don't see. Tunguska was a classic one in 1908, which flatlined several hundred kilometers of forest in the Siberian region. I'll talk a bit more about that later. More recently, we had Chelyabinsk. That was a 17-meter wide object with the kinetic energy of a hydrogen bomb that blew itself up over northern Russia. Bits of it fell into a lake. Some of it ended up on sale on various meteorite websites. It's all fantastic, and everyone got really happy. All the meteorite dealers did. But essentially, if that thing had been 3 times larger, well, you'll see what the problem is. On top of this, we now have this problem. This is the growing debris issue that we have in low Earth orbit. Now, this is one of the key areas of research I'm involved in, and it's one of my biggest bugbears. I have a massive love-hate relationship with SpaceX. You look at what they're doing with Starship, SN9, etc. It's fantastic. It's absolutely wonderful, and we wish them all the best in terms of the remarkable launch and land and relaunch capability that they've got. What they're doing with SN9 with Starship and the aim to get to Mars, fantastic. What they're doing with Starlink is nothing short of criminal. Essentially throwing up literally thousands, and they've got an FCC request in for 42,000 satellites in the Starlink constellation. The satellites currently have a 5% failure rate anyway. So if you've got 42,000 satellites in orbit with a 5% failure rate, you're looking at around about 2,000 redundant satellites moving at 8 kilometers per second in low Earth orbit. Now, there's all sorts of arguments about, oh, they'll deorbit easily. They won't. Some of them will, but some of them are at higher altitudes. And then you've got existing potential collision events where, 2 satellites colliding with each other, you will generate anywhere between 5 and 20,000 new pieces of debris. And right now, orbiting our Earth, there are 178 million pieces of debris that we've put there since 1960. So this problem is growing ever more acute. And why is it a problem? Well, it's a problem in that if we were to detect an incoming asteroid threat or an incoming cometary threat, and we've created such a mess in orbit that we can't even launch anything to get around that, then we're dead. And that's the big problem, is that if we create what's called the Kessler syndrome, if you've seen the movie Gravity, you'll know what the Kessler syndrome is. It's a collisional cascade of objects, and this could happen. This could literally happen at any point in time. At the moment, we have around about 2,800 active satellites in orbit, as I said, 178 million pieces of debris. But then there's all the inactive satellites. There's several thousand inactive satellites. You've got rogue nation states like, you know, the Middle East, etc., who don't have a huge space presence. So to them, space is, well, we're not that fussed about it. But they also have incredible capability in terms of hacking. The Indian mission to the moon that failed last year, there's all sorts of chatter on the defense forums, etc., that it was an Indian hack, basically, that disrupted that landing and that caused the Indian mission to fail. So you've got countries like North Korea, Afghanistan, Iran, etc., who have got the potential and the capability to cause havoc. All you need is one satellite to be taken control of and thrown into a collision course, and most of these satellites have got sufficient delta V or burn capability to move their orbits. If you take one active satellite, move it into a collision course with a defunct satellite, you can't move the defunct satellite, it's dead, but you're still going to create an absolutely catastrophic mess. So this is a major problem when it comes to observing as well. You only have to look at, you know, Simon was talking about the star count. I'm offering people a challenge this year. If you've got regular images over the past 5, 10, however many years of a particular region of the sky, fantastic. Hopefully you've kept all the original FITS files for those. Because what I'm encouraging people to do is take images of the same areas of sky, wider field the better. And instead of doing fancy processing and all sorts of stacking where you're reducing background noise, just do a sum stack on it and see how many satellites are going through that field of view over the period that you're imaging it, because I guarantee it's going up. And Starlink is already a problem. You know, Elon Musk has said, oh, we're going to reduce the albedo and we'll drop it down to magnitude 7. That's great. In terms of the general public, that's fine. They'll never see them again. So they don't think they're there. It's out of sight, out of mind again. But magnitude 7 to an astronomer is nothing. Any backyard telescope with any CCD can get to mag 15 easily. And most of the sky surveys can hit magnitude 23 easily. We were hitting magnitude 23 with Faulkes within 180 seconds. No problem on moving objects. So it's a growing problem. Now, in terms of what's out there, this is the growing satellite threat, as it were, and this is just a kind of indicator of what we're dealing with right now. This isn't what's coming, this is right now. And it's only getting worse, and it's getting worse literally day by day. A few days ago, Musk threw up 143 new satellites. That's 5% of the total number of satellites currently in orbit that's active. And if we carry on at this pace, literally we won't have anything in terms of launch capability. Because if it does go really badly wrong, it will go very, very badly wrong very quickly. And unlike the plastic in the oceans, which we can do something about and stop the drift, you know, they're only drifting at a few kilometers an hour, a few knots. This stuff's moving at 8 kilometers a second. You can't do anything about that. So we really need to get on top of this. Anyway, so going back to the comet and asteroid threat statistics. So I've given this talk to lots of people, and the common argument I get back from astrophysicists and astronomers and various people is, well, statistical models say blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, yes, the statistics show that there is an increase in terms of our observational capability, so we are seeing more objects, but we do miss them. You know, I worked on Faulkes for 6 years, and the reason we discovered so many asteroids is because the automated sky surveys missed them. So they have automated what's called data reduction pipeline, so the image will come in as a FITS file. A piece of software will then scan through the image, look for anything that's moving, look for if it's moving along known object trajectories, and say, okay, well, yeah, this is a known object. We'll file it against the Minor Planet Center, and we'll say, well, this is XYZ 123. We know that one, but then occasionally there'll be a new object, and the reduction pipelines will pick that up, and that may be a new comet or a new asteroid. But they still miss stuff. And over the course of 6 months, we found 22 new asteroids that they'd completely missed. So this is the thing. Don't think that statistics are, you know, the be all and end all, because to a lump of rock, what's a statistic? It's a lump of rock. If 2 lumps of rock hit each other, the chances of that, however remote or however non-remote they are, if you've got 800 trillion comets out in the Oort cloud, and you've got 800 billion comets in the Kuiper belt, and you've got 800,000 asteroids and or comets in the asteroid belt, that's a lot of rock out there, a lot of rock and a lot of ice and a lot of mess. And yeah, this is one of my favorite t-shirts I like to wear at conferences. It is nature's way of asking, how's that space program coming along? If the dinosaurs had had an interesting space program, maybe they'd have seen something 66 million years ago and been able to sort it out, but they clearly couldn't. So the shooting gallery that is near Earth object observation is quite neatly shown in this diagram. This is some of the Apollo Aten asteroids that do cross the Earth's path, as it were. We've got a few potentially dangerous ones, Apophis being one of the best known examples, where there was all sorts of talk a few years ago about, oh, it is going to hit and then it's not going to hit, and it's got to go through a specific gravitational keyhole, and if it doesn't do that, it's not going to hit, and if it does, it is. And then the observations being refined again, and some of the radar observations, and don't forget, we've now lost some of our best radar observational capability because the Arecibo telescope fell apart because the National Science Foundation couldn't be bothered to fund it. So we had the collapse in Puerto Rico of our best radar observation facility. The FAST telescope in China doesn't really have that kind of capability, and it's also owned by the Chinese government. And whilst they have said, yes, the scientific community can use it, yeah, good luck on that one. So this observation capability, whilst we have more and more telescopes going up into orbit to look for these objects, we do still miss stuff. Chelyabinsk was a bit of a wake-up call, thankfully, in that regard. Now, Apophis is quite a significant object, and we do get hit by quite significant objects from time to time. And this is a classic example. Barringer crater, incorrectly known as Meteor crater, in the Arizona desert. It's just outside of Flagstaff, about an hour's drive outside Flagstaff. If you've been there, it's fantastic. It's absolutely enormous. This was created by a 50-meter wide object, so only 3 times the size of Chelyabinsk. And that carved out a hole nearly a mile wide, about 500 feet deep in 1.3 seconds, and killed everything within a 600-mile radius. And that was 50,000 years ago. So these things do happen. And, you know, all through recorded history, thankfully 74% or 75% of our planet is covered in water. We've had collisions since then. We've had objects hit since then. We've had massive tsunamis since then. But only in the last few hundred years have we really had the capability to do proper observations and proper scientific data on this, gather proper scientific data on this. And I say in the last few hundred years, as I said, 1908, this happened. This was the aftermath of Tunguska. So something, and we still don't know what, possibly a rubble pile asteroid, possibly a fragment of comet 2P Encke, and this is the thing with cometary fragmentation, it happens all the time. Some of the modelling has shown that 2P Encke could have been the cause of this. No fragments have ever been found, no meteorites have ever been pulled out of the Tunguska region. It's one of those, Arthur C. Clarke covered it in the 1970s and 80s with his Mysterious World, and you know, there's all sorts of hokey theories about we pass through a black hole and all sorts. It was probably a rubble pile asteroid or a fragment of a comet that airburst, but the airburst, thankfully, was over a very remote part of northern Siberia, and all it did was kill lots of reindeer and flatline a lot of trees. Had this happened over Washington, London, Paris, Manchester, etc., a million people would have died instantly. No questions at all. But you think, well, okay, well, you know, that was 50,000 years ago. That was over 100 years ago. Russia's not a great place to go, trust me. You had this in 1908. You had Sakhalin, 1947. You've had Chelyabinsk. I mean, there's been quite a few strikes in Russia. It's a big landmass. These things don't happen, do they? Well, yes, they do. Now, thankfully, in our solar system, we have the Dyson vacuum cleaner of the solar system, aka Jupiter, which is now being accused of throwing objects at us rather than pulling them away. Gravitational field of Jupiter is immense. Let's make no bones about it. You could swallow the Earth 1,000 times in it. It's a wonderful planet to observe, but it's also a really nice way of stopping some things from hitting us and diverting, you know, potential cometary threats, etc. So, good friend of mine, David Levy, and Carolyn and Jean Shoemaker. Jean sadly passed away in Australia some time ago, looking at some of the craters out in Australia. We're up on Mount Palomar with an 18-inch telescope, so not the big 200-inch on Palomar, not even a 60-inch, just an average-sized telescope, going through the night sky, doing a usual observing run. And one night they were looking up and they saw what they thought were 21 comets. and they thought, oh, we've hit the jackpot. It's like we're going to get 21 comets named after us. Very quickly realized that it wasn't 21 comets, it was one comet that had been shredded, sent the data to the Minor Planet Center. Minor Planet Center said yes, came back and said, well, this is an object, we're going to designate it Shoemaker-Levy 9. This object obviously got too close to Jupiter in its last pass, and guess what? The orbital calculations that we've made show that it's going to strike Jupiter on its next pass. Now, this was one of the impacts. So the Hubble Space Telescope was trained on it. Pretty much every major telescope in the world was trained on Jupiter to look at these incredible impacts. That was just one of them. This is some more of them when they rotated into view, because it kind of hit the backside of Jupiter from Earth's perspective, as it were. Putting those into perspective, this is Jupiter, and as we know, the size of Jupiter, we've got the Great Red Spot, which could take the Earth 2.5 times easily into it. This is a nice little animation showing an explosion in infrared. Now, if you look at the size of that explosion compared to the Great Red Spot, you're looking at something literally the size of our planet. Any one of those fragments hitting the Earth, the only things left alive today would be Keith Richards and cockroaches. There'd be nothing left. We'd be gone. And that was only a few decades ago. Gene Shoemaker, David Levy, I mean, to this day, they say this should have been the biggest wake-up call. And what it was a wake-up call to Hollywood, because then Hollywood went away and said, oh, this is good. And they got a ton of money to make one appalling film called Armageddon and one reasonably good film called Deep Impact. They got more money by a factor of 10 than NASA got for their Deep Sky Near-Earth Object Collision Detection Program. So the cost of those two films was 10 times NASA's budget for observing these objects. It was ludicrous. Bruce Willis's salary for Armageddon was more money than they got. At the same time, CSIRO and the Australian government cancelled all the Southern Sky surveys. So we lost Rob McNaught and various other people who were doing fantastic work down there. So yeah, it's really good luck, everyone, because 2013 in February we had this was Chelyabinsk. As I said, this thing had the kinetic energy of a hydrogen bomb, thankfully an airburst 17 meters wide. Had that been 3 times larger, so the size of the one that hit Arizona and created the Barringer crater, then about 1.2 million people would have died that day. And then maybe the world would have woken up. If this had happened over Washington, maybe the world would have woken up a bit faster. But it happened over a remote part of Russia. And the Russian people initially thought it was a nuclear missile attack. It wasn't, obviously. But this should have been a major, major wake-up call to the threat. So what can we do? Well, we only have to look at the history of these impacts, and you look at how big some of them are. And as I said, thankfully, most of our planet, you can't really see the full extent there, but the Pacific Ocean obviously is about half the planet. About 75% of the Earth is covered in oceans. So you may think, well, if it's the ocean, it's not so much of a problem. Well, it is, because you only have to look at Indonesia and what happens when a tectonic plate shift occurs and you have a tsunami that kills 250,000 people on Boxing Day just over a decade ago. And that was traveling at about 200 miles an hour. What happens when an asteroid or a comet hits us of any significant size? I'll show you in a moment. But you look at the ranges and the size of these are in the kiloton regions. These are nuclear scale explosions. So Chelyabinsk was obviously that one there, which you can see in bright red towards the right-hand side over Russia, but we've had quite a few of these. And it's why, you know, my meteorite company, Everlight Meteorites, we do roaring trade in meteorite pieces, because lots of them thankfully hit North Africa and the African deserts and the Australian deserts and North American deserts. And when we managed to pick them up, it's around about 400 tons a year on average hits the Earth. But then occasionally we get things like Chelyabinsk, where, you know, as a lot more gets deposited at one time. And the thing with Chelyabinsk is that most of the astronomers were looking at something else at the time. They were looking at 2012 DA14, which was an asteroid about the size of a battleship. And you've got the Daily Mail and the Express are always saying, oh, something the size of a bus is going to skim past the Earth this weekend, and yada yada. It's like, the problem that introduces is that the public become very complacent. They think, well, it's not an issue. It's cry wolf syndrome. Every time something skims by at 2.5 times lunar distance and all the press go, oh, it's this catastrophe waiting to happen. It isn't. But one day something will be coming our way. And Hale-Bopp, again, should have been a wake-up call. That thing, you know, massive elliptical, you know, offset orbit, very high inclination, 1997, 35 kilometers across. In its orbit, had it been, they estimated a month earlier, it potentially could have collided with the Earth. It was either a month earlier or a month later. And, you know, Hale and Bott, I knew Tom Bott very well, Alan Hale as well. They've had nightmares about this ever since, or had up until the sad passing of them ever since. It's quite terrifying to think that not only cultists have basically ended their lives because of these things, but people are genuinely afraid, and they should be. That's what they said. You know, 35-kilometer wide impact on the Earth. We're looking at something 2.5 times the size of what wiped out the dinosaurs, and they were quite successful on this planet for several hundred million years. So anyway, so what can we do? Well, the scientific community, being crazy and kooky like they are, they come up with all sorts of wild and wacky and wonderful ideas. Gravity tractors, that's one of their fantastic ideas. It's not a real tractor. It's basically you send a large enough object into orbit around a small enough object, then essentially its gravity will perturb that of the smaller object and you will deflect it. Great in theory. The reality is not going to happen. The largest thing we've sent any further than low Earth orbit in 50 years has been the Cassini spacecraft, and that's about the size of a bus. So that's not going to happen, and not in the timescales that are required anyway. So gravity tractors, unless Elon Musk decides to dedicate some of his starships to it, not really an option. Unless you work for Dulux, the other option of paintballing an asteroid or a comet, we only had to look at how complex it was for OSIRIS-REx to get into orbit around an object and map it effectively, and Rosetta and all the failures that they had with the Philae spacecraft and the unbelievably complex orbital dynamics that are involved with Rosetta, orbiting an object out at the distances that will be required to paintball it. And why would you paintball it? Well, there's a thing called the Yarkovsky effect, the Yorps effect, where you change the albedo of an object on one side, and then solar radiation pressure basically will change its rotation rate, etc., and potentially change its orbit. That's fantastic if you can get to these objects out at around about the orbit of Neptune, but we've not been out that far since New Horizons and Voyager. So again, good luck on that one. It's not going to happen. And again, a lot of paint involved. So unless you work for Dulux, not going to be an option. Then we come to the favorite option of the US military and various other defense organizations. Oh, we'll blow them up. Well, I work for a defense company and you can't. Minuteman missiles, probably some of the longest range ones that humanity possesses, and they can get out to about half the distance of the moon. If you were to do that with an object 35 kilometers wide, potentially traveling at 186,000 miles an hour, you turn something the size of a large boulder into lots of larger boulders or smaller boulders, but still large enough to obliterate the planet. You turn a pellet into a shotgun blast, as it were. It's not going to work. It's one of the few things in those appalling movies, well, Armageddon being a very appalling movie, that they actually got right. You would really need to hit them much further out and get into the core of them. You're just going to tickle them. You could chuck every nuke on the planet at them. At the distances involved, you're still going to pepper spray the entire planet. So not really an option there. And as I said, largest thing we've sent out beyond low Earth orbit since 1972 has been Cassini, and that's about the size of a bus. So we're not exactly good at long range, large object stuff. So who are you going to call? What are we going to do? Well, he's not an option. Wonderful actor as he may or may not be, the whole precept of Armageddon, as we saw with Philae, trying to land even a robotic probe, a very small robotic probe, on a comet is very, very difficult. The gravitational field that they have is minuscule. The off-gassing, the jetting, the debris, we only had to look at what happened with Giotto and Comet Halley to see that the approach vectors, etc., are critical. You've essentially got to get out there before the comet really starts to outgas a lot. It's just not going to happen, not with current technology. Maybe in 100 years, maybe in 150 years, we will have the kind of technologies required. But right now, you're not sending Rio Tinto's redundant staff, because nobody wants oil anymore, out to a comet to start drilling. It's just not going to happen. So what is the key here? Well, finding them. And this is where even the amateur astronomy community can come into play here, because finding them is key, and early as well. The thing that a lot of conspiracy theorists seem to go on about is you know, if one of these objects is detected, nobody will tell anyone. That's rubbish. CBAT and the IAU and the Minor Planet Center and all of the astronomy community, we file our data. If I, you know, was working on Faulkes and we were detecting new objects, we were filing the data same day, obviously, so we could hopefully get discovery on them. But that data is then in the public domain. Nobody hides anything. So these things, if they are seen by the astronomy community, will be divulged. And there's amateurs out there with access to 1 meter class instruments that can hit magnitude 22, 23. So if the professionals see it, you're very sure soon after the amateurs are going to see it. And most of the time, it's the amateurs that spot them first. Terry Lovejoy, you know, I think he's got about half a dozen comets now to his name, and that's from a backyard telescope in Australia. The problem is, how do you find them? So pop quiz here. Spot the comet. It's not the bright thing in the top right hand corner, that's Mars. It's not the bright thing in the middle, that's a star. If you look down at about the 7 o'clock position, there's a kind of hand-shaped darker patch. In there is the comet. And this is the thing with these huge wide field sky surveys that are incredibly sensitive, that they need to be able to see things that are moving. And this goes back to that Starlink problem and that debris problem, in that very soon we're not going to be able to see anything with automated reduction pipelines, because the amount of clutter up there is going to be so intense that it's going to be incredibly complex for these automatic computerized pipelines to do any data reduction. And you think, okay, we could use radar and radio telescopes. Well, Band 5B, which is one of the key bands for radio astronomy, again, is being decimated by Starlink, the observational capabilities of radio telescopes. And then people say, well, why can't we just put more Hubbles up? Well, we can, but Hubble's in low Earth orbit and is susceptible to the same threats. And you say, okay, we've got the James Webb. Yeah, the James Webb is fantastic, but the James Webb so far has cost around about $10 billion and is massively behind. It's like almost 8 years behind its launch schedule, and still may not work. There's not been a full integration test of the James Webb, and it's out at a very nice Lagrange point, which is fantastic for infrared astronomy. But if anything goes wrong, there's no rescue, there's no recovery mission. That thing's got to work first time, unlike the Hubble. It's literally got to work first time. So the whole argument of, oh, we'll put telescopes out at Lagrange points, or we'll put telescopes on the moon. We haven't been to the moon since 1972. The last time we flew to the moon was Gene Cernan, Jack Schmitt, Ron Evans, 1972, Apollo 17, with the computational power of ZX81. So saying we're going back to the moon, yes, we probably will with Artemis. I'm hoping that we go back with Artemis, because that SLS is, again, a horrendous Boeing construction waste of money, costing so far about $20 billion. Hopefully SpaceX and the commercial organizations will do a better job in terms of cost overruns, etc. But yes, we will go back to the moon. We will hopefully set up a base there. But thinking about putting up big telescopes and big radio telescopes on the far side of the moon is still right now science fiction. So if you want to read an Andy Weir novel and read Artemis, that's fantastic, but it's not going to be happening in the near future. So the comets, as I said, that's a close-up image of that comet, actually. Just going back to that one, that was it. Well, it looked like close-up with the Faulkes telescope. So what can we do as amateur astronomers? Now, Simon was talking about some of the options. You know, you've got telescopes, obviously, that you have your own access to. You've got community telescopes. One of the best things I think about lockdown is the access and ability to dial into telescopes all around the world. So you've got the iTelescope network, you've got the SecMuon network, various telescopes. We kind of rent a scope model all around the world where people can do real science. And one of the things we really focused on with the Faulkes telescope was encouraging kids to do real science. Yes, it's great to take pretty pictures. Oh, look, here's a pretty picture of Orion. Here's a pretty picture I took. Yeah, it's great. But it's the scientific value of that compared to the thrill of finding a comet. And we were mentoring a 16-year-old student. Her name was Hannah Blythe, during the course of the 6 months we were going on this kind of big asteroid hunt. And she helped us with a lot of the detections and a lot of the work on the fragmentation of certain comets. And on the back of that, she got nominated for Woman of the Year. She got to meet Princess Anne. She won a Blue Peter badge. It was fantastic, and she'll never forget that. You know, and hopefully at some point, the Minor Planet Center are now giving us the naming rights to the asteroids that we found. We got one earlier this year. which was a Jupiter Trojan, bizarrely. But as some more of these come through, one of them is going to be named Hannah Blythe. We're not allowed to name them after ourselves, but one that she wasn't involved in the detection on, we're going to name after her. So it's one of those fun things that if you were to discover a new comet, it immediately gets your name. If you were to discover a new asteroid, you get to name it. As long as you don't give it a crazy name, it's all well and good. So telescopes like the SECMURAN, Faulkes, all these other telescopes, if you're involved, especially with education, they typically will give you free access. Faulkes Telescope, if you're working with a local school, get the school teachers to talk to them. You can then help and guide and run programs for them. That's what I did with Faulkes for 6 years, was pro-am collaboration. So it's really important that everybody really starts looking, really gets into looking for these objects. Now, if we find one and it's proven by the Mayan Planet Center or whoever that it is going to hit the Earth, who knows what's going to happen? You only have to look at COVID and the fact that something so small has wrought so much havoc to this planet in such a short period of time to realize that this is a threat. The breakdown of society can happen. The breakdown of everything that we know can happen. Deep Impact was a really good movie for that. It highlighted it quite nicely. Jerry Griffin, who is the Apollo flight controller, most famously on Apollo 12 when he had to call a near abort, and apart from John Aaron saving the day with SCE-2 Orgs. But Jerry Griffin was one of the consultants on Deep Impact. I've talked to Jerry many times about this, and he said, yeah, it really hit home the threat here. But I go back to this rotation rate. So as I said, our solar system is rotating around our galaxy once every 250 million years. Now, we haven't had a big impact on this planet in 66 million years. The KT boundary, the Cretaceous tertiary boundary event off the Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago, which wiped out 86% of all life on this planet, specifically the dinosaurs. But we've had multiple mass extinction events all through the Earth's history. And they're not always aligned to this rotation rate, but let's just say we're long overdue something hitting us. We really are long overdue. It's 66 million years since we've had a good one, for want of a better term. 50,000 years since we had the Arizona impact at Barringer Crater. Only 7 years now since Chelyabinsk. It's not when, or it's not if, it's when. It's not if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. And that's the reality. Now, I talked about Hollywood and the Hollywood movies, etc. 2 movies were made on the back of Shoemaker Levy 9. One was called Armageddon. You've probably all seen it. A horrendous film. It's used by NASA as a training video to see how many scientific mistakes you can actually make in one movie. I think the record count that they got to was about 812. Jason Isaacs is in it. Great actor, really funny line when he talks about, are you really going to trust somebody got a C- in astrophysics? Best line in any film ever, in my opinion, but still a shocking film. The other film that was made at the time by Catherine Bigelow, a fantastic director, was called Deep Impact. And you've probably all seen this, but this was so accurately modeled that even the people who worked on it were like, is this really what's going to happen? And I'm only going to play a short clip of this, but when we say about, oh, we're okay if it hits the sea, well, let's just put that into context of what will happen if a large object hits the ocean. So, as I said, Indonesia, Boxing Day, just over a decade ago, we had a massive tsunami traveling at around about 200 miles an hour that was around about 25, 30 feet high. Something a tenth of the size of Hale-Bopp striking the Earth would create a tsunami around about 2,000 feet high, traveling at 1,000 miles an hour, which is essentially what you're seeing here. That's real because we saw that in the Indonesian tsunami where the waves, the shoreline got pulled out. This is the bit that got the kids crying at Kielder. You can see the age of the film because the Twin Towers are still there, but this is the kind of scale of event that could happen. And this could happen with the collapse of part of the Canary Islands as well. There's all sorts of potential faults with the Canary Islands, so it's not just asteroids. Nothing's going to stop that. Nothing we have, no technology we have at all. I was quite hopeful of when I first heard about Starship being developed, thinking, right, finally we've got something comparable size to a Saturn V. If we were to launch multiple objects the size of a Saturn V into low Earth orbit, use one of them as a refueling station, and then send a cluster of them out to Lagrange points, ideally somewhere near Mars, if possible, or stable orbits near Mars, with enough residual burn capability that they could intercept an object, and you'd need enough of them to do this, then potentially, if we were able to get into orbit around a threatening incoming object with something the size of a Saturn V, then the F1 engines on that are still the largest liquid-fueled engines ever developed. You could then do a burn that could potentially deflect an object. You could then take it away. You could dock with it and then sufficient burn time, move it just enough, and you'd have to be far enough away to do this. You're not going to do it when it's near low Earth orbit or near the moon's orbit because you're too late. At that point, you're way too late. But that to me was the only technological solution we had, or we still have. And I'm hoping that at some point, once we've realized that we're messing up the sky with Starlink and we stop doing that, we're going to turn back to this as a primary issue, because as I said, it's not if, it's when, and it is going to happen. And unfortunately, you know, bless his heart, even though he tried to take down the Capitol a few weeks ago, Chuck Norris is also not the answer to our extinction problem. He's not going to solve the world's issues, and it's up to the politicians and hopefully the great scientists, and science is what's saving the world now with the vaccine. So let's hope that science again comes to the rescue at some point. And on that note, I'm open to questions, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Nick. That was great. I'm going to need a stiff drink now.
Sorry about that.
So everyone can unmute their mics and feel free to ask Nick questions.
May I ask a question?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, the slide that you showed that talked about the mass extinctions, it talked about reefs.
Yeah, it's some of the data in terms of coral reef growth. They've looked at the timelines. It's just one of the side effects. Obviously, we can enter with mass extinction events. If it's created by an asteroid, we can have vast changes in terms of the planet's temperature, etc., and then the recovery from that. The bounce back effect from that, you can have nuclear winters, which obviously will cool the planet down, but then you will get a bounce back effect, which they think is related to specific coral. I always get asked that question. It's always related to coral reef growth. But the only thing is, in terms of the extinction timelines, I just find it quite terrifying that some of them do tend to not exactly line up with, but obviously you're looking at vast traverse times from the Oort cloud, but a perturbation in the Oort cloud, a mass perturbation in the Oort cloud, you're going to potentially send hundreds of comets into the inner solar system. And they will take anywhere up to 1 million years to arrive. That's the other thing. So, you know, the effect of a close proximity perturbation, as it were, with the Oort cloud, we still don't understand to this day. We haven't obviously imaged anything in the Oort cloud, so we don't really know what the extent of stuff is out there, apart from the observations we've made. I think it was, as I said, the Herschel Space Telescope did some observations of quite a few star systems and found these mass water clouds at around about 1 light year away from the central star. So,
Thank you.
Can I ask a question about albedos?
yes.
You said very near the start of your talk that the albedos, these objects, you know, way out there, and go about sort of, you know, 25% out of lump of coal,
Yes.
which most of us regard as having quite a low albedo. Can you explain why this is, and is the albedo equally low if you're talking about, say, infrared rather than visible light?
You could, but the infrared, don't forget, with infrared telescopes, I mean, James Webb's going to change this. Infrared telescopes obviously are at a longer wavelength, so you need larger aperture to get the resolution and the definition. The albedo, typically, it's a dirty snowball, so you got a lot of primitive carbon compounds, etc., which is reducing the overall albedo on a lot of the cometary bodies. You look at some of these images from Rosetta, and whilst they're extremely stretched in terms of linear stretching in applications like Photoshop, etc., to show some of the detail, and they're using very low light sensitivity CCDs out at the Oort cloud and even Kuiper belt distances, these objects are incredibly hard to observe, A, because they're moving, B, because they're quite small, so typically in the 5, 10, 15 kilometer radius, and then with a very low albedo, as noted, it makes it incredibly hard to get direct imaging on them. We've only imaged Kuiper belt objects for probably about the last 20, 25 years, apart from Pluto, obviously.
But it's the reason for the albedo that puzzles me, because I mean, how different would the material on them be, say, compared to the surface of the moon?
Oh, well, it's not a case of albedo relative to any of the asteroids, or it's relative to a planet, for example. Some of the planets, due to planetary atmospheres, obviously the gas giants, we're seeing a lot more in terms of reflectivity from that. But obviously out at those distances, with a relatively low albedo due to the carbonaceous nature of the coatings and the surface, and the fact that they are being resurfaced as well. You only have to look at some of the images from OSIRIS-REx, and you've got rubble distribution constantly happening and constantly kind of mulching up what you're seeing on the surface. So it's not a case of it's any less, but it's just more complex to image at those kind of distances. That's the key point. We're not really seeing them, as I said, until they cross the ice line.
Okay, thank you.
What do you think about Elon Musk's idea that we need a second planet, so that when the first one we either wreck or gets blown up?
Fix the first one first. We've got enough problems on this planet. I mean, it's the notion of, I can agree with the idea of it gives us a lifeboat, but given, as I said, that we've not been back to the moon since 1972, that we never colonized that correctly or properly. If we're going to send a bunch of hippies, pardon the pun, out to Mars on these big colonization missions, there's a lot of science still needs to be done on Mars, and it really annoys me that we've got to get scientific boots on the ground first and really understand what there is on Mars, because if we start trashing it in the way that humanity is good at, we're not going to get much in the way of science. We won't be able to ever prove potentially that there was life there that wasn't brought by ourselves. You only have to look at the hydrazine dump with the Schiaparelli spacecraft. We're dumping hydrocarbons all over the planet anyway, which we don't really need to be doing. I'd like to see more science first before 150 or 200 colonists decide to go on a one-way mission. And people talk about going to Mars and isn't it going to be fantastic, and they watch The Martian and it's like, oh, isn't it lovely? Just go out, go up to the Northern Arctic, go out to places like Svalbard and just walk around there at minus 50 degrees, and just it very quickly becomes very tiresome. And if you've got nothing more than a desert, and yes, it's going to be exciting from an exploration point of view, and yes, we will get there eventually en masse, and I would hope that we will colonize both the moon from a research perspective and also Mars at some point. They are potentially going to be lifeboats. The idea of terraforming Mars is ridiculous. I talked to Caroline Porco quite a lot, and the whole notion of terraforming Mars, the theoretical side of it is one thing. The reality is just not going to happen, not in our lifetimes anyway. The idea of creating big spheres and living inside domes like the Eden Project, that's probably more viable. That's the whole premise behind books like Artemis by Andy Weir for the moon, etc. I'd just like to see more science rather than a bunch of hippies.
Hi Nick, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Have we seen, a couple of questions actually, have we seen much hit the moon that can give us a good idea of what potentially could hit us and see what damage it does?
Not big stuff. Obviously, we look at the moon and you realize that during the late heavy bombardment, that was a shooting gallery. Obviously, we've had plate tectonics, work of weathering, the oceans. So a lot of the cratering on the Earth, although we do know a lot of the larger impact craters from, subsurface radar imaging, from orbital imaging, there's various craters now appearing, or not appearing, but being discovered, as it were, So we know that the Earth was hit quite heavily. A lot of it's been wiped out in the geological record. With the moon, obviously, in the last 4 billion years, there hasn't really been that much change. So we can see the devastation, especially on the far side of the moon. It's just a complete mess. Recently, we've got transient lunar phenomena. There are smaller impacts still hitting the moon to this day. It's one of the fun things, if you are a regular lunar observer, to catch those. If you take in, high frame rate videos and you were lucky enough to catch one of them, it's fantastic to see, and I've seen a few of those from amateur observers over the years. But nothing large has really hit the moon in recorded history, as it were. If it were to, there was an incident in 2013. There was a 2013 A1. There was a comet potentially going to strike Mars. Everybody thought it was going to hit Mars for a while. ESA and the other space agencies even moved some of their orbiting satellites because the potential threat for that. The rover drivers were all having kittens because it would literally have taken out the rovers. Thankfully, it didn't. It came close, but didn't hit Mars. I would have liked to have seen it hit Mars, to be honest, because I think it would have got great scientific data. We'd have seen an impact in really high levels of detail. We'd have seen what exactly happened. Hopefully that would have woken up Congress and the various other organizations, governmental organizations around the world, to start funding this a bit better. But sadly, not on the moon, not in our lifetimes. But who knows? I mean, the great thing about colonizing the moon is you're increasing your risk there as well, because you've got no atmosphere to help you. So anything larger than a baseball is going to cause a bit of a problem there.
Mm-hmm. The other one was a cheeky question. Was you mentioned about people selling chunks of meteorite and stuff. Where can you reliably buy a piece of meteorite?
For sales pitch, Nick.
Good details, please.
We've taken a bit of a back seat. I've got to be honest. So I work for a company called Aerolite Meteorites. We are the biggest meteorite company in the world. My boss is a guy called Jeff Notkin, who ran a TV show on Discovery Channel called Meteorite Men, him and Steve Arnold, for a number of years, about 4 years it was running for. In the COVID era, I've taken a bit of a moral stance in that I don't feel it's right to push bits of rock at people who are losing their jobs and losing family members. So we've kind of stepped back a lot from that, and I've just focused a lot on STEM and outreach for the last 12 months with the full support of Aerolite Meteorites in that regard. But if you desperately do want one, let me know. We've got meteorites from a few pounds up to, like, I've got pieces of Mars in the cabinets behind me, which are in the thousands. I've got a gigantic piece of Cericho, which is a big palisite that's about $4,000. But yeah, we're taking a bit of a backseat at the moment. But if you go on aerolite.org is the US website, meteorites.io is the European website.
Sorry, what is it? Aerolite? Which one was the?
Aerolite.org is the US website. Meteorites.io is the UK European one. The other issue we've got right now, thanks to Brexit, is import and export duties skyrocketing. So what we've got in stock are okay. We don't have to pay ridiculously inflated duty prices now for European transfers and exports, but that's all going to change. So joy.
Brilliant. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Nick, could I ask a question on space debris?
Yes.
Are there realistic projects going on at the moment that you think?
Are the realistic projects? Sorry, I missed the last bit of that.
Are there realistic projects going on that you think will actually make a difference to all that debris?
Nope. No, not now. Okay, so you've got companies like Astroscale, SST. I mean, I've given entire talks on this. I think Simon was at the one I gave to Wiltshire Astro. Essentially, the big problem is you've got a commercial drive at the moment to put lots and lots of these so-called mega constellations up in orbit. Elon Musk has set the bar. He's reduced the launch costs. He's made it commercially viable. He's estimating that he's going to put anywhere between 30 and 42,000 satellites up there. As I said, we've got 3,000 active at the moment, so we're increasing the number of satellites in orbit by a factor of 12 once his constellation's up. So then you've got, on top of Starlink, you've then got OneWeb. The UK government invested 500 million in OneWeb, now backed by SoftBank in Japan to the tune of 1.4 billion, and the UK government want to put up their constellation. Then you've got the European Union wanting their constellation. Then we've got China, then we've got Russia, then we've got all the other nations, spacefaring nations, who are going to want their own constellation because they're going to want sovereign capability. So potentially we could be looking in the next 10 to 15 years of 100,000 new objects in orbit. Now, since the era of Sputnik, and thankfully Sputnik completely deorbited, but since that kind of epoch, we've put up 178 million pieces of debris. There was an artificial ionosphere put up in the early 60s, the Space Needles, which there's still millions of them floating around. And as I said, kinetic energy, Simon will know this from a talk, a team at the University of Florida fired something the size of a can of Coke into a satellite. So a typical satellite bus, not the CubeSats, the kind of 10 by 10 centimeter ones, but a typical satellite bus, maybe about the size of a fridge. They hit a typical satellite, fully configured, looked like a real satellite, in a test chamber at 7 kilometers a second, and it took them 1.5 years to get the debris pieces out of the foam lining around it. They got nearly 170,000 pieces of debris from that one collision. Now, the Kessler syndrome is a real thing. It is going to happen. We had 2009, an Iridium satellite and a Cosmos Russian satellite collided, and again put thousands of pieces of debris into orbit. We had the ASAT tests from the Indian and Pakistani and Chinese and US governments who've all fired, missiles and said, oh, look, we can knock out a satellite. Fantastic. The Indian ASAT test put pieces of debris in 2,200 kilometer orbits in terms of height. That stuff's not going to deorbit for 200 to 300 years. And that's going to drift around up there. And all we need, as I said, is a catastrophic failure or a hack, and it's all going to go wrong. Now, going back to the mitigation, you've got SSTL, satellites, we're talking about harpoons. The most stupid idea, and everybody in the engineering scientific community says it's a stupid idea. Why would you want to fire a harpoon at an object in space? Because if you miss or you have a glancing blow, all you're going to do is create more debris. And there's a whole thing with, the conservation of energy, and you hit something and it's got no reaction wheels and no capability to kind of avoid that or rebound or whatever. It's a mess. Then there's the idea of the net. Now, the net's slightly better, still not exactly ideal. Again, if they miss, you're just going to put a big net in orbit. And the issue is they're all 1-to-1 ratio in terms of astroscale. They're going to send up a satellite to deorbit a satellite. So it's a 1-to-1 thing. How's that going to solve a problem of 178 million pieces that are the size of a grain of sand and up? So the smallest pieces are microscopic. Anything over the size of a pea could potentially go straight through the cupola window on the ISS and kill every astronaut on there. Something the size of a Coke can could trash the ISS, depending on where it hit. So that's $200 billion and 6 dead astronauts. Anything larger than that, it's game over for anything. And it's all going pumped up into low Earth orbit, and nobody seems to be giving this a second thought. There's lots of agencies and companies like Astroscale, etc., saying, oh, we're going to do this, and it's not enough. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission in the United States, are granting licenses right now like water to Starlink. So whatever barrel Elon Musk has got the US government over, he's doing really well at getting this stuff up. And in the face of a global pandemic, I said this a few days ago on Twitter, it's a case of shiny syndrome. Everyone's looking that way at the pandemic. Nobody's noticing this big mess that we're thrown up into orbit. And it was, David Attenborough, until Attenborough featured it on, on the BBC, nobody cared about plastic in the oceans. It was one of those things that, out of sight, out of mind. We call it squirrel in the backyard syndrome. A squirrel dies in your back garden, you don't like it and you're going to remove it. If a squirrel dies in the forest across, half a mile away, you don't care because it's out of sight, out of mind. And that's the thing with space. To the general public, space is still a rich person's playground, and it's big toys for big boys kind of thing. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And nobody's taking this seriously. But no, right now there is not one solution to get around this. My company have looked at aerogel concepts. The Department of Defense, US Department of Defense, were developing a synthetic hagfish slime. So if you've ever seen hagfish slime, it's horrible stuff. But it expands to 10,000 times its volume when it touches water. And we had this idea of basically almost gel capturing clouds of debris. But the issue you've then got is you've then got to be able to deorbit that very, very rapidly. Otherwise, you could potentially be on a collision course because you've got a change in orbit with another object. And it's, again, it would almost be a declaration of an act of war, as it were, if you were to take out, deliberately take out or indirectly take out, say, a Chinese or a Russian satellite. They wouldn't like that, even though the Russians are doing nefarious things all the time. They've had ballistic tests in orbit. They even put a cannon up on the Almaz. Some of the spacecraft in the 1970s, they were orbiting space stations. They had a cannon on one of them. So the whole, treaty of the late 60s, the kind of non-proliferation and no arms in space, is rubbish. I mean, Russia have been ignoring that for decades. So there's a real threat, there's a real issue. And as I said, all you need is, there was an interesting thing at DEF CON last year, a big kind of cyber conference, where the US Department of Defense said, right, this year's challenge is hack a satellite. So they gave it to a bunch of school kid teams, in effect. I mean, the team that won this were a bunch of 17-year-olds from Poland, as far as I remember. It took them 12 hours to change the software, uplink the new software, reposition the satellite, fix its reaction control system, redirect it, take an image of the moon, and then beam the image down. And this was a Department of Defense satellite that they hacked in very short period of time. And the issue that you've got is that lots of the satellites up there were never built for this. They were never built for cyber resilience. They were built using computational power that, you'd have in a pocket watch these days. They're still active and they're still working, but they have no cyber resilience. So you've got some disgruntled guy out in North Korea. North Korea got amazing hacking capability, don't get me wrong, who say, well, we haven't got any satellites up there. It's not going to affect our nation. So what if we were to take hold of this one and control it and do a little burn and then put it in a direct collision course with this Russian satellite and create just an unholy mess? And then that unholy mess hits other satellites and they hit other satellites and you get this domino cascading effect, and then nobody launches a thing. So right now, sadly, no. It's horrible, but we don't.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but it needs to be out there more. There's the National Astronomy meeting in Bath in October, November this year, and one of the panels is on mega constellations, because obviously the RAS and the astronomy community are seeing this as a major threat to observational astronomy and the decimation of the night sky. And radio astronomers are now saying, whoa, this is going to give us lots of problems as well. But the astronomy problem is only at the tip of the iceberg, because if we do get a cascading Kessler effect, we're back to 1957. This planet is immediately back to 1957, and we lose defense capability, we lose global transaction banking capability, we lose communications capability. As George Clooney famously said in Gravity, half of the world's just lost Facebook. All of these things that we rely on are gone, and the collapse of the economy will make COVID look like a walk in the park, because we won't be able to do anything about it.
Sadly, that's probably what it's going to take for people to take notice, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's the thing. TEDx, Bill Gates gave the famous talk at the TED conference years ago, saying the next big threat to this planet is a pandemic, is a virus. And nobody paid any real heed to it. Thankfully, some of the labs like BioNTech, etc., did pay heed to it and started developing concepts that are now coming around to save us. But the British public and the world public really didn't pay much heed to this. And it's the same with debris in space. Nobody's paying much attention to it. There's a few of us shouting from the rooftops, and I know John Amos at the BBC and various others are now really waking up to this and saying, hold on, if we keep throwing more and more stuff into low Earth orbit, where's it going to go? And they say, oh, it's very big, and space traffic management and autonomous systems. Yeah, because computers never fail, do they? Yeah, I grew up on the era of War Games, which is, to me, to my mind, still one of the best films ever made, because the concept is still valid. The technology may have moved on several decades, but that notion of computers being fallible. There was a great instance with JPL not that long ago. They had a Raspberry Pi, which they were using for some testing inside JPL. Somebody hacked it. Somebody got in and got into the Deep Space Network via a Raspberry Pi that was in JPL. There was a fish tank in a casino in Las Vegas, and if you watched any of the Oceans movies, hacking casinos is not something you want to try. But somebody had left an IoT sensor in a fish tank in a Vegas casino that was on their network but wasn't protected, and they managed to hack in via that route. The big one last year was SolarWinds. SolarWinds is some of the most robust defense software out there in terms of securing firewalls. Somebody spoofed it, got in, and basically pulled terabytes from the US Department of Defense. So when people say, "Oh, my computer's safe," rubbish, absolute rubbish. The NHS was brought to its knees only a few years ago by the WannaCry hack. So when people say computers can't be hacked, well, the next big frontier for computer hacking is space, and people are just waking up to that now. So,
all very sobering stuff.
it is, isn't it? Terrifying.
You mentioned that the chance of actually spotting anything, we don't spot everything.
Yep.
So has anyone come up with, and we have to spot it out as far as Neptune, has anyone come up with a network, or a series or a configuration of observing satellites or something that might give us much better coverage?
Yeah, there are plans. I mean, James Webb will be one of them. The SKA's capability, the SKA, even though it's a radio telescope, it's got 50 times the resolution of Hubble. So in terms of anything that's distinctly visible in the radio end of the spectrum is going to be very good. A lot of the sky surveys do this anyway. There are orbiting telescopes planned already, some of them in orbit, which are looking at averting the problem that we had with Chelyabinsk, because the biggest problem with Chelyabinsk was it was coming in from a sunward direction. So you can't really point a telescope in that direction from the Earth, because you're just going to be pointing straight at the sun. But if you put something out at certain points around the Earth in terms of Lagrange points in orbit, then you do have some coverage. The issue there is that if we find it that late in the day, it's game over. We really do need a concerted effort to put, and the James Webb would have been a great example of that, but then the cost is so biblical that it's probably not going to happen again. If the James Webb fails, and the SLS fails, you could be looking at the end of NASA, to put it bluntly. I mean, that's $20 billion plus. That will be down the Swanee. But we still need that capability. We need the ability to look out for these, inherently faint moving objects. Hale Bopp, 35 kilometers wide, discovered by two amateurs, one amateur and one professional, Tom Bopp at a star party, and Alan Hale at Observatory roughly at the same time, and they had to send telegrams. So thankfully we've moved on a bit from then, but information dissemination, that's the other thing, is it's a societal breakdown as well. The information dissemination back, even at the time of Hale Bopp, it was telegrams, and you could contain information to some extent. With what we have now, it's all over social media. If somebody, does a selfie, it's on social media and breaking Kim Kardashian takes a selfie and it breaks the internet in 5 minutes. That's the problem that we've got in terms of how you control that. And the end of Deep Impact was really quite sobering when it came to, for want of all the best world and what the president was saying of the price of a pint of milk isn't going to change, etc. Society broke down, and it will happen. And people will become very protectionist. There was an interesting conference I attended a few years ago where they modeled one of these threats, these impact threats. And there were delegates there from India and Pakistan. And genuinely now, the Indian delegation said, well, what would it take to move it just far enough so that it hits India rather than hits us? And the Indian delegation was saying the same. It was that ridiculous. They were literally looking at, well, how can we make sure it doesn't hit us? But it'll hit, they don't care if it hits somebody else, as long as it doesn't hit them. And all the scientists at this meeting were just staring in utter disbelief at these people who are genuinely suggesting this as a solution.
Oh, we're in trouble. Okay.
We are. And, you look at it's not just our government. The government responses around the world to COVID have been sometimes very good. Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, lockdown, etc. They've taken a very pragmatic and very reactionary and potentially extreme approach, but it's worked. But then you've got other governments around the world, ourselves included, where we've got the high death rates, etc., because of potentially a lack of action at the right time or the appropriate time. And with something like this, there won't be any time. If we detect a comet 35 kilometers wide at the ice line, we've got 9 to 12 months to do something. And in 9 to 12 months, we're not going to be able to build, launch, send to and destroy an object moving at potentially 50 to 100,000 miles an hour heading our way. So SpaceX could be both the death and the savior of the planet. If Starship works, then that's the only option realistically, unless Artemis. But Artemis, the cost of an Artemis launch is $500 million, they're saying, per launch. Congress, and they've only got 8 SRBs, they can only launch like a few of them. So it's going to be, enough for 8 launches, 16 SRBs. It's what it is, but we are very good on this planet of being reactionary rather than proactive of what we need to do, and we need to build the solutions now. That would be what I would do if I was advising any government. I would say, look at the real threat. I mean, the other big one with satellites is if we get a Carrington scale event. The last time we had anything remotely close to a high X-class flare event hit the Earth was in the late 90s, and it took out half of Canada's electrical network, and substations got set on fire, etc. If we had something Carrington scale, when you've got 42,000 very small, very unshielded satellites in low Earth orbit, good luck on that one, because they're all going to die. Starlink could not sustain a Carrington scale event. There's very few satellites that could. Some of the defense ones possibly, but everything else is just going to die. And then you've got an unregulated collision course just waiting to happen.
Is there any solution to how we clear up that debris?
Stop launching more and start sending up. I mean, it needs to be an intergovernmental approach. It needs to be a global approach so that no one country sees another country's actions as a threat. And you need to have a very targeted deorbit strategy where you've almost got a garbage collection truck that can pick things out of orbit, almost like the angry alligator, James Bond, You Only Live Twice kind of scenario, where you're literally taking objects out of orbit and then not bringing them back down with the same spacecraft, but spitting them back down in effect. So essentially, if you've got the ability to do a calculated deorbit burn, either putting small retro thrusters, capturing the object, putting small thrusters on it, releasing it, and basically saying, right, we're going to deorbit and we're going to deorbit into the Pacific. So, the Tonga Trench area where a lot of the stuff ends up getting dumped, Apollo 13's RTG still at the bottom of the Tonga Trench. If we were to do that and have a sustained effort for many years with these garbage, because most of the debris we can track, there's some bits we can't, but most of it, NORAD, etc., are tracking. Celeste track, you only have to go on Celeste track, you can see what's trackable. Anything above 5 to 10 centimeters typically you can track, so the smaller stuff is still a problem. But if we can clear a lot of it out with a reusable system where capture, spit it down, deorbit, burn, keep going, then that's good. But these one-to-one missions where you've got this, tethered approach where you latch onto the satellite with magnetic tethers or with clamps or whatever, and then you boost it into a higher orbit or you deorbit. The Northrop Grumman MEV was a classic example of that recently, where they latched onto another redundant satellite, gave it propellant capability again, because the satellite's electronics was still fine. It just run out of propellant. So the MEV latched onto it, gave it that multi-axis propellant capability. That would be one solution, but it needs to be across government, almost United Nations driven and sanctioned and signed up by all of the spacefaring powers. So, America, I mean, this is the other problem, that America, Russia and China are all so suspicious of each other that, if you approached a Russian satellite, defunct or not, they're going to say, well, this is our technology. You're not deorbiting that. I mean, some of the satellites that are up there that have gone pop in the last few years, in terms of maybe the batteries have failed or whatever, they've still got, from a defense perspective, state-of-the-art technology on there. There was the laughable thing a few years ago where US Department of Defense offered NASA 2 Hubbles that they built. They basically built 2 other telescopes with the mirror capability slightly better than the Hubble. And it's like, why did you have these? Why do you think? Where do you think they're pointing? You know, we've got sub 10 centimeter resolution now from orbit easily. Even synthetic aperture radar can go to between 10 and 30 centimeters, depending on what information you know or don't know, and that can go through cloud. So you need to have this capability sanctioned and signed off by everybody for it to work, or you're just going to get World War III starting again.
Any other happy questions to ask before we close the evening?
It takes your mind off COVID.
It does, yeah. No more questions? That's a good lot of questions anyway. So I'd like to thank Nick for your time this evening and giving us a wonderful talk where I now shall sleep uneasy. My wife will blame you, so I'll send her or give her your address. And I know I should be watching out for comets and asteroids, and I don't have to worry about gamma ray bursts anymore frying the planet, because that's very unlikely compared to yeah.
But no, enjoy the astronomy. And as I said, if you're taking images, and a lot of us are, don't just stack them and remove all the background noise, as it were. Look out for moving objects in them. You'd be amazed what you spot. It's really it's a fun hobby, and you may find something new. You know, we did. So
yeah. Excellent. And of course, is it Jay Tate, and he's got his Space Guard facility?
Absolutely, Jay Tate. He's doing fantastic work with Space Guard. There's loads all around the world that are doing this on a nightly basis. So the more people doing it, the better. The more chance we've got of spotting something. So.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. That brings the formal part of this evening to an end. Everyone can go off and sleep well, have their cocos, or maybe that stiff gin. I'm going to hang on for a while, so if people wanted to have a quick chat about anything, then they're free to. So I'll be the last one on, but you're free to go away unless you want to have a chat or talk about anything. But thank you very much, Nick. Bit of a round of applause.
Cheers. Thank you all. Thanks for sticking with it.